Bleeding and hunted, Sitala ran through the Arizona dark with her husband's killers somewhere behind her, and by the time she reached the one lamp still burning for 20 miles in any direction, everything, both she and the lonely rancher inside that barn, believed about being alone, was about to change forever. Arizona Territory, the last week of August 1889. The Ocotillo Range stood black against a sky gone, the color of a bruise, and the basin below it held exactly one point of light, a barn lamp burning past midnight because a stallion inside had been difficult that night, and a tired man hadn't wanted to leave him in the dark. She didn't know whose light it was when she first saw it through the brush. She only knew it was the only light there was, and she ran toward it with her arm wrapped in a torn strip of her own sleeve, blood dried dark along the cloth, brush tearing fresh lines into her skin with every stride. By morning, she was gone again, the blanket she'd slept on folded into a perfect square on the bench, and the only proof she had ever been there at all was 7 stitches in her forearm and a man standing at his kitchen window trying to remember what the silence in that house had felt like before her. Ironwood Ranch didn't announce itself from the road, and that was by design. A fence line came first, sun-bleached and leaning a little east, the way a fence leans when it's tired of standing straight in wind that never lets up. Then, the barn. Then, if a person kept looking the house, low dark-timbered, built board by one pair of hands over 3 long winters, every joint a shade off true, in the particular way handmade things are, and somehow better for it. The sign over the gate just read, Ironwood, no year, no flourish, which was the most Jesse Holt thing in the territory, if you'd known him long enough to know there was such a thing as a Jesse Holt way of doing anything at all. Almost nobody had known him that long. He was 31, weathered past his years by a decade of fence posts and branding irons, and quiet in the particular way that made strangers mistake him for cold when really it was economy. A man who had learned the hard way not to spend words on people who wouldn't be staying long enough to deserve them. 7 years earlier, he'd had a wife, Eliza, a bright, stubborn woman who had chosen this land before she'd ever laid eyes on it because she trusted him, and he had trusted that trust enough to build an entire house around it. Nah. Then the 3rd winter came and a fever came with it, and he rode 20 miles in the dark to find a doctor, and rode 20 miles back with a doctor beside him, and none of it mattered, because by the time they reached the house, it was already too late to matter. There was a room at the end of the upstairs hall he'd built to catch the morning light, meant for a life that never arrived in it. He kept it swept. He kept the curtains drawn. He never once in 7 years stood inside it for longer than it took to close the door again. Mateo showed up at 6 every morning without fail. 61 years old, born in Sonora and raised on the theory that most sentences weren't worth finishing. He had a white mustache, one permanently raised eyebrow, and knees that had spent 4 decades urging him to slow down and gotten exactly nowhere for the effort. He'd worked Ironwood 6 years. He'd work it until one of them quit breathing, and neither man had ever discussed the arrangement out loud because some things didn't need explaining to be true. Mornings went the same way they always did. Coffee, boots on the porch, the ranch waking up slow and a little resentful, as if mornings were an imposition it never fully accepted. Jesse had decided, years back, that this was fine. That saw. He'd stopped noticing he was deciding it. It was the last Tuesday of August when the ordinary shape of things broke open. Jesse was 40 minutes from the house, resetting a fence line that had been sagging since June, the kind of quiet work that empties a man's head out, which, in his experience, was the only kind of work worth doing. He heard nothing first. That was the strange part. Then the creosote scrub shifted, in a way scrub doesn't shift on its own, and a woman stepped out of it like she'd been standing there a long while, deciding whether to be seen at all. She was young, 25 maybe, though her eyes made the number feel almost beside the point. Dark, level, already weighing him, before he'd spoken a word. Her hair hung black and braided past her shoulder, her jaw set hard against whatever it was costing her to stand upright, one arm pressed tight to her ribs, a strip of torn cloth wound around her forearm, gone the deep specific dark of blood that has dried more than once. She stopped 15 feet off. She didn't reach for him, and she didn't reach for anything else either. She only looked, and Jesse understood in the wordless way a person understands where they're coming, that she wasn't looking for help at all. She was deciding whether he was worth the risk of asking. He set the wire stretcher down slow, both hands open where she could see them, because he'd lived in this country long enough to know a man who hides his hands is a man with something to hide. You're hurt. His voice came out low, the same tone he used gentling a spooked colt. She didn't answer. He nodded toward the ranch, 40 minutes off, and started walking without waiting to see if she'd follow. She followed. He didn't raise a single question the whole way there. Not what happened, not who did it, because he'd spent enough years alone to know that questions raised too soon were just another kind of pressure, dressed up polite. The kitchen table was where he stitched her, working from the old tin kit he kept under the sink. Needle and thread and carbolic solution he'd used on Mateo once, and on himself more times than he cared to count. She sat with her spine straight through the whole of it, the cut deep and ragged, 4 inches at least, and she didn't make a single sound while he closed it. 7 stitches. Clean, her eyes tracking his hands the way a person watches something they intend to learn. He set a cup of water in front of her, without asking if she wanted it, then tapped his own chest. Holt. She studied him a long moment, weighing that too, before her own voice came out lower than he'd expected, the accent careful and specific.
Sitala.
Quote, Chiricahua, he guessed, and kept the guess to himself, because naming a person out loud before they'd introduced themselves properly felt like a kind of theft. Known, Hurry-a-nay. That night he laid a blanket on the front room bench, without a word of explanation, and went to bed. He lay awake longer than usual, aware of the house in a way he hadn't been aware of it in years, not alarmed, just conscious of a different weight in the air. He woke before dawn, same as always, and came downstairs to an empty bench, the blanket folded into a square so precise it stopped him cold for a second before he made his coffee and went to work. He thought about her maybe 6 times before noon, which he counted, privately, as a victory over the 16 times he would have allowed himself if he hadn't been trying. 3 ordinary days passed, fence work, cattle checks, a stubborn joint in the water pump that ate half an afternoon, and most of Mateo's patience. On the 4th, Jesse was in the barn shoeing a young black stallion named Ash when he heard boots that weren't Mateo's dragging step. Sitala stood in the doorway, morning light behind her, a bundle of dried plants tied with a leather strip held out toward him. She pointed at the bundle, then at her own arm rewrapped. Now in a cleaner cloth she'd changed herself, a gesture as plain as any sentence. This, for healing, better than what you used. He took it with both hands. Thank you. She gave one small nod, and then her gaze slid past him to Ash, 18 months old, and a problem since the day he'd arrived, smart enough to know exactly what he could get away with, and mean enough to try it. She crossed toward the stall at an angle not straight on, and stopped a foot from the gate, turned slightly sideways, and lifted one hand palm up, offering nothing, demanding nothing, simply present. Ash tossed his head, backed a step, ran through his whole catalog of objections to the world. She didn't move. She had, Jesse thought, a patience that seemed to have no floor to it at all. The barn went dead quiet. Then, slow and deeply suspicious, the horse stretched his neck out and touched his muzzle to her palm and exhaled like something he'd been bracing against. For a year and a half had finally let go. Mateo found Jesse still holding the hoof-pick, staring, and nodded toward the empty doorway where she'd already gone. Apache, Chiricahua. Mateo was quiet a moment. You know what you're doing? Mateo nodded slowly, like that settled something, and went back to work. She came back the next day, and the day after that, no pattern to it he could ever predict. Sometimes morning, sometimes an hour before dusk, never announcing her arrival and never marking her way out. She fixed a section of cellar roof using a technique he'd never seen, angled to shed water in a way his own flat repairs never managed. She found the skunk that had been raiding the henhouse for 2 weeks and resolved the matter without a sound by a method he still couldn't reconstruct afterward. She showed him plants instead of explaining them, held a leaf to a cut on his hand, watched his face to see if he'd understood, moved on when he had. He learned her. Yes, a small nod, chin dropping. He learned her that's wrong. A tilt of the head to the right. He learned that when she looked at a thing for more than 3 seconds without moving, she decided to approve of it. One evening near the south fence, she crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the dirt, held them there and looked up at him until he crouched beside her and did the same. She moved his hand 6 inches over and pressed again. The difference hit him at once, warmer and drier at the first spot, cool and faintly damp at the second, weeks after the last rain. She traced the long slope above them with one hand, then the ground under his fingers, and made a gesture he learned meant because of that. He turned it over a moment. Different drainage, different soil underneath. She nodded once, her English careful and exact, surprising him even though by then it shouldn't have. Without words first, the hands understand before the mouth does. He kept that answer the way he kept everything she gave him, without putting a word of his own beside it. If 2 wounded, guarded people slowly learning to trust again is the kind of story you love, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name for early access to videos. The evenings became a habit neither of them had planned. They sat on the front steps, not the porch swing, which felt too much like a decision, just the steps where they happened to end up. The Ocotillo Range went from amber to copper to shadow above them, while the stars came out thick as river sand, and the dark between the points of light didn't feel empty so much as occupied a second landscape laid over the first. In pieces, over many such evenings he learned about a valley, 3 days' ride east, a river she measured by spreading both arms wide. He learned she knew 17 uses for a plant he'd spent a decade pulling out of his east garden like a weed. And one evening when he mentioned Eliza's name, without meaning to, she went still, and then gave a single word back, Kanti, and he understood, without needing the rest of the sentence, that it was the name of the husband she'd lost. How long ago? 3 winters. There is a particular silence 2 people share when they both buried someone, a silence with its own particular weight, complete on its own, and they sat in it together a long while before either one broke it again. The morning everything tipped over was a Wednesday. Jesse came downstairs before first light expecting the dark kitchen he always found, and instead found a lamp lit and a smell he couldn't name. Pinyon, smoke, dry grass, something with a medicinal edge underneath it, the kind of knowledge that passes hand to hand for generations until it lives in the fingers without ever stopping at the brain. Sitala turned from the stove. Good morning, and it came out easy, unaccented, ordinary. The English of someone who'd been speaking it since childhood, because she had. He stood frozen in the doorway while his mind ran back over 3 weeks of conversations with Mateo. Every stray word to the horses, everything he'd ever let slip within earshot, assuming she couldn't follow a bit of it. You speak English. Even to his own ears it sounded foolish. Since the first day, she set the pot aside. Without turning around, I understood everything, from the moment you stood at that fence line. He sat down slowly in the same chair she'd occupied that first night at the table, not angry so much as embarrassed, and underneath the embarrassment something almost amused the whole time. Every conversation with Mateo. Every complaint about the water pump. That's practical. I needed to know what kind of man you were before I trusted you with the rest of me." She poured tea from a clay pot into 2 cups that weren't his, brought from wherever she'd come from, and slid one across without asking. "You talk to your horses more than your hired man. You swear less than most men when things go wrong. And things go wrong often out here. You haven't opened the door at the end of the hall once. In 3 weeks, the kitchen went very still. No, I haven't." September wore into October, and the ranch's careful predictability, the whole architecture Jesse had built his life around, fence work at dawn, water at noon, cattle before dark, because predictability was the one thing that couldn't up and leave in the night, simply stopped applying to Sitala, and somehow, without him quite deciding to let it happen. That stopped feeling like disorder and started feeling like weather. You didn't argue with weather. You adjusted to it. On the steps one clear October night, she shared pieces of her family, half in Chiricahua and half in English, and he understood most of it directly and the rest from her hands. The width of a river, a direction further east than a man could ride in a day. Your people. The pause. They're still there? Some. The word carried a weight. It hadn't carried when it used to mean all. He didn't ask what had happened to the others, having learned by then that forcing a moment never made it arrive faster. It only broke the shape of whatever might have come out of it on its own. The story of Eliza came out on an ordinary afternoon, not because the moment felt right so much as because it stopped feeling avoidable. They were at the kitchen table, she working through the cattle ledger with a pencil, marking questions in handwriting small and exact, and nothing like his, loose, functional scrawl. Her name was Eliza. Just that. Just the name. Sitala set the pencil down and didn't rush to fill the silence. She chose this land before she ever saw it, he went on. I described it to her. She trusted me, and I trusted that trust. He gave her the rest of it. The fever, the 20 miles out and 20 miles back, the doctor who arrived too late to matter. When he finished, 2 words came back. I know. Not I'm sorry. Not that must have been terrible. Just recognition, from someone who understood exactly what it meant to have a person and then not have them. She rose, crossed to the hallway, and stopped in front of the door he never opened. She didn't touch the handle. She laid her palm flat against the wood, the same way she'd touched Ash's jaw in the barn, not pushing, not testing. Only I see this. I'm not pretending it isn't here. Then she came back, picked up the pencil, and mentioned that the water line in the south pasture would fail before December. Everything in the room was exactly as it had been a minute earlier, and everything had also moved by the width of one closed door. Word came on a Thursday in November, 5 riders on the main road, coming slow. Jesse saw them from the north pasture, with time enough to walk back unhurried, hands visible and weight in the yard. The man leading them dismounted without ceremony, 55 or so, built solid, the posture of a man long past doubting his own authority. Holt, that's right, Natan, Sitala's uncle. She'd mentioned him only once, simply that he existed in a tone that had carried considerably more weight than the words themselves. Natan looked the ranch over slow and systematic, barn, house, fence lines, the garden plot behind the house where Sitala's herb rows had been growing. 6 weeks now, forming an accurate picture rather than an opinion. She's been spending time here, she has. Why? Jesse actually thought about it before answering. Because she chose to. I didn't ask her to come. I haven't asked her to leave. A longer silence. What do you want from her? Straight as a survey line. Nothing she doesn't want to give. She's not a simple woman. What she carries isn't only hers. You understand that? I'm starting to. I don't understand all of it yet. Most men would claim they do. Most men would be wrong. Something shifted in Natan's face. Not quite approval, more like a mark entered in a ledger. He glanced past Jesse toward the corral. where Ash stood calm at the rail, in a way that was not remotely his default state. She worked that horse. First week, before I'd managed it myself. Natan almost smiled and pulled it back. She always could. He put a boot in the stirrup. Sitala makes her own decisions, always has. But she has a people, and that doesn't change because she's here. I know. I wouldn't want it to. Natan looked down at him. She mentioned the arm, he went on, his tone shifting by a degree. That you treated it, that you didn't press her with questions. Nothing that mattered. Natan turned his horse without another word, and they went the way they'd come. Before Sitala's grandmother decides Jesse's fate, become a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name. It helps this small channel keep telling stories like hers. Sitala arrived the next morning earlier than usual, the light still gray, her breath visible in the cold. He wanted to know what I meant to you. What did you tell him? The truth, that I didn't want anything you didn't want to give. A silence stretched a moment. You'll speak to my grandmother, she went on. She'll want to meet you. I figured she won't make it easy. That's fair. She turned to look at him fully, the way she did when something mattered enough to earn her whole attention. Why fair? Because she doesn't know me. She's protecting you. A pause. Probably something larger than you alone. Sitala looked at him, a long moment. Yes, she is. The camp sat 2 hours east by horse, tucked into a natural shelter between two rock walls that caught the morning sun, a place Jesse had ridden past 100 times without ever suspecting it existed, a fact that was proof enough of how carefully a people learns to keep what's theirs when the world has given them ample reason to be careful. 40 people or more moved through it, fires burning low for warmth rather than cooking at that hour. Structures of hide and shaped timber fitted with a precision that read as effortless only because someone had spent generations refining the same problem until it looked that way. Met them at the ridge, and something in his nod had shifted since the ranch. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the active weighing that had been there before, like a test. Jesse hadn't known he was taking, had quietly concluded. She's inside. Natan tipped his head toward the dwelling at the center. The dwelling wasn't the largest, but it held the center anyway by gravity rather than size. Nasha sat cross-legged on the far side of a small fire, 71 years old, and somehow both older than that and ageless at once. The particular density of a woman who has moved through the whole of a life. Her eyes found Jesse the moment he stepped inside, direct, unhurried, offering nothing by way of greeting. He stood and let her look, and didn't fill the silence because he'd learned that the instinct to fill silence with explanation was a nervous instinct, and he'd learned, slowly, to let it pass. Nasha's voice moved low and even in Chiricahua, each phrase given its full weight before the next arrived, and Sitala carried it into English. She says you're taking something on. Not me, what I carry, what my knowing is for. Not fully. I understand it as much as I can right now. I'll understand it better as time goes. Something moved through Nash's face, small, like a door shifting a quarter-inch without opening. She went on. Longer this time. She says the knowledge I carry came from my mother and her mother before that, which roots for a fever, which bark to boil, which leaves, pack, a wound, in the field when there's nothing else. If I stay at your ranch, I don't stop being the keeper of it. There will be times my people need me more than your fence line does. You need to understand that before you understand anything else. I understand it, or I understand it as much as any man could from the outside. Nasha listened to the translation and gave one short phrase in return. She says that's an honest answer, Sitala translated, which from her in this room is not nothing. Tea came, poured by a young woman who moved through the space with the ease of someone who'd performed the small courtesy 1,000 times. Jesse took his cup with both hands, the way Sitala had shown him without ever explaining why, and something small registered in the room when he did it. Nasha wanted to know, through Sitala, about the land, how long he'd held it, why he'd stayed when other men left, what the east pasture looked like in the dry months. He answered, in specifics, not generalities, because that was how he talked about anything he actually cared about. Then Nasha turned to the matter of Silas Crane, directing the question at Jesse himself rather than through Sitala, as though his answer mattered more than hers would have. He filed an expanded claim 2 weeks ago. The new boundary he's asserting runs directly against my eastern fence line, which means before he reaches your land, he has to come through mine. I don't intend to let him. Nasha held his gaze while Sitala carried the words back, then went on, her voice quieter, carrying it. The man who killed Kanti believed land was a thing you could own by putting your name on paper. She has watched men like that take and take for 40 years each time. They filed something that claimed they owned what they'd taken. She wants to know, what makes you different? The room went very still. Jesse took a real moment before answering. I don't know that I am, completely. I came here and claimed land and built on it and put my name on it. I know how that looks from where you're sitting. He held her gaze. But I believe land isn't owned by whoever files the paper. It's held by whoever tends it, learns it, stays through the bad years as well as the good ones. Your people tended this territory since before my name existed. That's not a small thing, that's the whole thing. Nasha looked at him a long time after the translation landed. Then she reached into the blanket across her lap and drew out a small object, holding it closed in her fist before continuing, and Jesse caught the change in Sitala's voice before the words themselves arrived. She says Kanti was a good man, who loved her the way he knew how to love someone, but he died before he learned that protecting a person and standing beside them aren't the same thing, that a woman who can read land and heal wounds and speak 3 languages doesn't need to be kept safe. She needs to be seen a breath. She says she's watched me for 3 years since Kanti died. Watch me carry what I carry. Watch me choose to go to your ranch, choose to stay, choose you. Sitala's voice caught slightly. She says she doesn't trust easily, and there are reasons for that which are hers, and won't disappear because one man behaves decently. But she says you have good hands, hands that work on their own without needing to be instructed. Hands that held the needle steady on a stranger's wound and didn't shake. Nasha extended her hand, and in her palm sat a leather bracelet worked in a geometric pattern Jesse recognized from the blanket. Sitala kept rolled behind her saddle. Sitala's voice dropped, just for him. It was Kanti's. Nasha gave one more phrase. She says she's not giving you this because she trusts you. She's giving it to you because Sitala trusts you, and Sitala has never once been wrong about a person in 25 years. Don't make her regret teaching her that. Jesse reached forward and took the bracelet with both hands, the leather worn soft with years of use, and looked up at Nasha and gave her the same slow, deliberate nod he gave Sitala when something was understood and didn't need words. Nasha nodded back. The first time Jesse would learn later that she had done that for anyone in longer than Sitala could remember. They rode home in the low copper light of late afternoon, Ash easy beneath Sitala the way he only ever was with her. She'll never fully like me. No, she agreed, but she'll watch you continuously for as long as you're around. That seems right. She has 40 years of reasons. I've had a few months. I'd think less of her if she decided anything at all on a few months. Sitala glanced at him sideways. Most men would call that insulting. Most men would be thinking about themselves instead of the reasons. She turned back to the mountains, quiet for a stretch. She gave you Kanti's bracelet, she managed. Like a fact, she was still absorbing herself. I know. She kept it 3 years. I didn't know she still had it. A pause. She doesn't give things away. She says objects hold the life of whoever wore them, and you have to be careful who you put that kind of weight into. Jesse looked down at the bracelet resting on the saddle horn. Then I'll be careful with it. Something in the set of her shoulders eased. 1 degree, real and visible if a person had learned to read it. He had learned to read it. December came in hard and didn't negotiate. Frost on the troughs by morning, the cattle bunching close in the south pasture, Mateo arriving each day with his collar up and remaining even quieter than usual. Silas Crane made no move that whole month, not with guns, because Crane wasn't a man who dealt in guns. He was a man who dealt in paperwork and the slow, grinding patience of a process built to favor whoever had filed first, which, in Jesse's experience, was often worse than a gun, because you couldn't answer it with your fists. You had to answer paper with paper. There was an afternoon in December when Jesse walked past the door at the end of the hall and stopped, the way he sometimes did, and this time he put his hand on the handle and left it there long enough to hear the wind shift outside. He thought about what Sitala had shared with him once on the south pasture, that a person builds what they can and stays and figures the rest out as they go. He turned the handle. The room was exactly as he'd kept it, swept and curtained, a chair in the corner that had never once been sat in, an east window built to catch morning light that had never been allowed to reach it. He stood in the doorway a long while, past the kind of grief that came out as tears and into the older, quieter kind that had simply become part of the frame of him. He heard her on the stairs before he saw her. Sitala stopped in the hall, looked at him standing in the open door, and came and stood beside him without a word, both of them looking into the room together. I built this for her. She never slept in it once. Sitala looked at the east window. Good light, softly. That's why you chose that wall. She stepped past him, crossed to the window, and pulled the curtain back. Afternoon light spilled in, not the morning light the room had been built for, but light all the same, honest and plain, the Ocotillo Range visible through the glass, under a sky sliding toward December blue. You built a room to hold the light, and then you kept the light out. She turned to face him. She would have loved this window. She would have. Sitala held his gaze a moment. Jesse Holt, the whole name, careful, set down deliberately. You built this house to welcome someone in. You're still allowed to do that. I know, which wasn't the same as anything he'd worked all the way through yet, but it was further than 7 years of keeping that door shut had ever let him get. He didn't close it when he went back downstairs. Crane's paperwork landed on the 14th of January, filed formally at the Territorial Land Office in Cottonwood Crossing, an expanded boundary that ran exactly as Sitala had predicted, straight through Jesse's eastern fence line and into ground the Chiricahua Band had worked long before anyone employed at that office had been born. Jesse didn't wait to see what came next. He rode out before dawn. Mateo left mining the ranch and reached Cottonwood Crossing the moment its doors opened, arriving the most prepared man in the building, because Sitala had spent 3 weeks helping him build the case, cross-referencing her grandmother's records against his own deeds at the kitchen table until the lamp burned low. Her handwriting, small and exact in every margin. He carried his original deed, the boundary survey from the year he'd filed his claim, a letter from the county surveyor confirming the eastern line, 12 years of cattle records proving continuous use of the eastern pasture, and one thing more, a set of documents Nasha had kept 25 years in a leather case wrapped in oilcloth, stored where only she knew, recording the band's presence in that territory by named landmark and named season, written in both Chiricahua and English, because someone a generation back had understood that one language alone might not be enough when the day finally came. The day had come. Registrar Wexford, mid-40s, the look of a man who'd built a career on decisions that never required him to leave his chair, took his time with the papers Jesse laid on his desk. You understand, Mr. Rext. Crane has also filed documentation. Carefully. I do. I also understand his documentation asserts a boundary the county survey doesn't support. Everything east of my line is either mine by deed or in documented continuous use by the Chiricahua Band for 25 years. That's in the stack as well. Wexford studied the band's records, his expression working through something complicated. These were prepared by people who knew the land, Jesse went on. Before any of this was filed, the dates are there. The place names are verifiable. You'll find them accurate. Wexford sat back. I'll need to verify. At last, of course, he stood, hat in hand. Crane will push back on this. Let him. The documents say what they say. He left the office without another glance back. The matter settled in his own mind long before any registrar confirmed it. If you want to see love and the law beat a man like Silas Crane, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, right now. He rode home under a sky going bright and cold. The Ocotillo Range, snow dusted along its highest edge, thinking about what Sitala had shared of Kanti. That reason alone hadn't been enough against men like Crane, but reason paired with 25 years of a woman's careful record-keeping. Sitala was in the yard when he reached Ironwood, Ash's head already turned toward the road before she'd heard a thing herself. He'll verify a week, maybe 2. And then Crane has a problem, because the survey doesn't lie, and your grandmother's records don't either. Something moved through Sitala's face, not simple relief. Something older, the specific feeling of a weight carried a long while finally set down. She kept those records 25 years, she managed. Everyone thought she was holding on to something that wouldn't matter, that she was being stubborn. She was right. She's usually right. It's genuinely exhausting. A real smile broke across his face, the kind that didn't come easy and was unmistakable when it did. That evening they stood together while the stars made up their minds, one at a time, and then all at once, the cold settling in around them, unhurried. Sitala? He'd been turning the words over for weeks, trying to build them into some careful shape, before understanding that the shape they needed was just to be spoken plainly, the way everything between them always had been. The night you walked out of that brush, arm wrapped, spine straight, you looked like you were in the middle of deciding something. I was. What did you decide? She was quiet a moment, the stars doing their business overhead. That you had good hands, and that you weren't afraid of the things in front of you, only the things that were already gone, and that those were the right things to be afraid of, which meant you weren't wrong, just stopped. You decided all that in 30 seconds. I'm observant, a beat, the good kind of silence. And what did you decide to do about it? She met his eyes. Come back, and see what you did with it. He stepped toward her the way he'd learned to move toward anything that mattered. Unhurried, nothing hidden, and she didn't step back. He raised a hand to her face, his thumb along her cheekbone, the same hand that had driven fence posts, and closed a stranger's wound and held the dead man's bracelet with both palms open. She lifted her own hand and laid it flat against his chest, the way she'd touched Ash's jaw. That first week, the way she'd touched the closed door at the end of the hall. I have understood this, or I am confirming it now. His voice dropped. I've been standing still 7 years. Her answer came simple. I know. And then you walked out of a creosote bush and I dropped a perfectly good fence tool. She laughed, the real version, quick and warm and startled out of her, nothing careful left in it at all. And when she looked up at him still bright from it, he leaned down and she didn't move away. The kiss wasn't dramatic. It wasn't built for anyone watching. It was exactly the right size. His hand at her face, her palm flat against his chest, the cold air around them, the stars conducting their vast, indifferent business overhead. When they drew back, neither of them moved their hands. My grandmother is going to have opinions about this for the foreseeable future. I'm counting on it. She warned you herself. It's exhausting. The laugh again, shorter, but there. 3 mornings later, Mateo let himself in, at 6, as always, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. 2 cups on the table, set across from each other rather than side by side. 2 plates in the wash basin from the night before. On a hook beside Jesse's hat and jacket, a heavy blanket coat in deep brown and rust red, made by someone who knew how to work wool the old way. Mateo looked at the cups. He looked at the coat. He looked at the ceiling a moment, the way a man does when he's decided, for reasons of personal dignity, not to name a feeling out loud. Then he went to the storage room, came back with a pine board and a small box of hardware, and set to work on a new shelf in the tack room. Should have built one a month ago, he put in, to no one in particular, and went to work. They rode to the camp the following week, the morning cold enough to see their breath, the Ocotillo Range sharp-edged against a clear sky. Naughton met them at the ridge and walked them in past a community, busy with its own ordinary morning. Fires, horses, the low sound of people complete within themselves. Nasha sat where she always sat. The fire burned low, the same direct look landing on Jesse the moment he entered, nothing added and nothing withheld. Jesse laid out through Sitala what had happened at the land office, the documents, the survey, Wexford's week of verifying, and the letter that had arrived 4 days past confirming Crane's expanded claim rejected, his asserted boundary found not to exist where he'd claimed it did. The 25 years of band record sufficient to bar any future claim on that ground. Nasha listened without expression through the whole of it. Then she gave one thing, and Sitala's voice went softer, carrying it across. She says her mother always believed the day would come when those records would matter, and she kept them 25 years, never knowing if that day would actually arrive. A pause. She says tell the man with the good hands that her mother was right. Jesse looked at Nasha directly. Your mother kept those records 25 years, and today they protected this land. That's not a small thing. It's the right thing. Done for the right reason by a woman who understood the future would need it long before the present gave her any proof it would. He hesitated. I'd like to learn more of them, if you'd be willing to teach me. Nasha was quiet, the fire shifting, a log settling into itself. Then she gave a short, certain reply, and Sitala relayed it with something close to wonder in her own voice. She says you'll need to learn the language properly, if you mean to understand them. Then I'll learn. Nasha held his gaze a long moment and gave 2 more words. All right, Sitala relayed. And from Nasha in that room with 40 years of hard-won reasons behind her, that was very nearly everything. They rode home in the thin, long light of afternoon, the mountains throwing their shadows east, neither of them talking for a stretch, the silence between them the kind that didn't need anything more in it. There will be more men like Crane, I know, and my grandmother will keep watching you like a problem that hasn't finished declaring itself. I'm counting on that too. She glanced at him sideways. You're a strange man, so I've heard. That evening on the steps of Ironwood Ranch, the sky doing its January work overhead, stars dense and burning, the cold, clean and still, Sitala broke the quiet first. I want to stay. Jesse looked at her. She looked back, steady, the way she looked at everything that genuinely mattered. Here, with you, here is only where you happen to be. He turned the coffee cup in his hands a moment. I'm going to get things wrong. About what I don't understand yet. About what I think I understand and don't. I know, and you'll tell me when I do. Continuously. It'll be tedious. I'll manage. The real smile came then. Both corners, the full version, arriving without apology. Jesse Holt, the way she always used his whole name when something needed to be placed exactly where it belonged. Sitala, just as careful. They sat together on the steps of Ironwood Ranch in a cold Arizona night, the Ocotillo Range dark but present the way permanent things stay present. Inside the house the fire burned low, and the door at the end of the upstairs hall stood open, the way it hadn't in 7 years, and the east window in that small room held its curtain pulled all the way back, waiting for morning to finally do the one thing it had always been built to do. 2 cups sat drying by the basin. 2 coats hung on the same hook by the door. Neither of them named the word forever out loud because it had never needed naming between them. Only this, plainly, the way everything true between them had always arrived. She had chosen to stay, and he had chosen to let the light back in, and for 2 people who had each buried someone they loved and built a wall instead of a window. That turned out to be the whole of what mattered.